Hello, welcome back one more time. My name is Katie, and today we are talking about autism. So in my early 30s, when I started really kind of diving into the question of whether my bipolar disorder diagnosis that I'd received 10 years prior was the best diagnosis, was accurate, or whether perhaps something else better described me and my experiences. I, being a book nerd, of course, dove into a shit ton of books. And so today I wanted to talk to you about some of those books, the ones that I recommend, the ones that I don't, and when I recommend reading the books that I do recommend, because I think some are more helpful at different stages of your journey. Now, before we dive in, I wanted to preface this video with two things. The first is that I am giving you recommendations on books that I have sought out to read myself. So I'm hoping that you, regardless of your experience, might find some books here of value and interest to you. But please know that this is not representative of the entirety of autistic experience. When I was doing my research, I was very much looking for experiences that I could see myself in. So I was looking for late diagnosed women and AFAB folks. Primarily, that is the experience that I was looking for to reflect my own. And so that is primarily what is represented in the books that I'm about to talk about. The second thing I wanted to preface this with is that obviously I have not read every book on autism. And so part of me was kind of waiting until I'd read all the books to make the video, but that's impossible. Obviously that's impossible. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to recommend you some books that I have read and enjoyed that I think you should read or look at reading if you're questioning whether you might be autistic or how the autistic experience may or may not apply to you. The second round of books are those books that I think you should read if you've either received a diagnosis or you have identified strongly with the autistic experience and you believe yourself to be autistic. The third category of books I want to recommend are more like the memoirs that I've read that I've really enjoyed. Then at the end, we're going to talk about the books that I haven't yet read that I do have on my shelf, just to kind of like add to your reading list, or books that you might want to look into to see if they're relevant to you. And then I do also want to talk about a book or two at the end that I would not recommend, that I would like actively disrecommend. Is that a word? But anyway, with all that said, we have an awful lot to go through, so let's just get started with the first category of books to read when you're thinking about whether you may or may not be autistic. The first one I want to suggest is this little book. It's called I Think I Might Be Autistic, A Guide to Autism Spectrum Disorder Diagnosis and Self-Discovery for Adults by Cynthia Kim. It's a very, very short little book, and essentially what it seeks to do is to break down the diagnostic criteria as it exists in the DSM, but just make it a whole lot more accessible and relatable, particularly to adults. So what I really liked about this book is that it broke down and kind of discussed each of the diagnostic criteria and what they actually meant, like just kind of put it in a little bit more layman's terms. And then for each of the diagnostic criteria, and not just like the larger diagnostic criteria, but each of the individual kind of little parts to it, it gives a whole bunch of questions for you to answer yes or no to give you a sense of whether this diagnostic criteria might apply to you. And this just helped me understand the diagnostic criteria in a much more holistic way, and also in a much less like literal perfectionistic kind of way, which is the way that I was looking at the diagnostic criteria, and I'm sure a lot of other autistic people do a similar thing. Essentially, I think it just asks much more relevant questions, particularly for adults to consider. So where some of the criteria will talk about struggles with eye contact, like, I mean, that's something that I can do because I force myself to do it, but it's a very conscious thing and I get distracted by it. But to me, I was like, well, no, I don't struggle with it because I do it. Whereas for this part, under the difficulties with nonverbal communication, some of the questions are, do you have trouble coordinating eye contact and gestures or other body language during a conversation? Have you been told that your facial expressions are inappropriate for the situation or do not match your feelings? Have others told you that your facial expressions often look angry, depressed, or blank even when you don't feel that way? Do you find yourself imitating the accents or speech patterns of the person you are talking to? Anyway, so what I'm saying is that these questions kind of really allow you to access some of those really specific examples that you might not even think of just reading through the diagnostic criteria. And so this little book really helped me just kind of start to understand the ways in which the criteria might actually apply to me and might actually describe my experience. And having this, and because I wrote yes and no next to, or sometimes, or question mark next to every single one of these questions, this was also really like a helpful document for me when I decided finally that I did want to talk to my psychologist about the possibility of me being autistic. Kind of having this laid out in a structured way that aligned with the criteria but just like made more sense to me allowed me to verbalize and give examples of some of my experiences. Now, what I've just described is basically like the first third of the book. The rest of the book has a whole bunch of different chapters. They're all very short, but, you know, for example, it talks about, I think I might be autistic. Now what? It has a chapter essentially exploring the pros and cons of choosing to seek an assessment or not, even provides some alternatives to seeking a formal diagnosis. Like, for such a short little book, it's like barely 100 pages. This is just such a great place to start. Next up, we've got a book called What I Mean When I Say I'm Autistic, Unpuzzling a Life on the Autism Spectrum. Again, this is a really, really short little book, so quite like a non-intimidating sort of place to start. And it's described on the back as a mix of memoir and manifesto, and I would definitely agree. This one too is broken down into a bunch of chapters, including like with subheadings and stuff, so I just found it very easy to read and digest. And in this, the author is basically going through her experience of like figuring out that she might be autistic as an adult and just talking about a bunch of her experiences, but in a very structured kind of way. So again, I just found this really useful. You can see that when I was going through, I tabbed and underlined an awful lot in here, where this book helped me start to see myself in relation to the criteria and how maybe the criteria applied to me. This book just really helped me feel very, very seen. She gives some particular examples of things that she's struggled with or dealt with or just experienced throughout her life. And she just has a very great way of succinctly putting words to those experiences. And throughout, she also gives examples of like how to advocate for yourself. So again, a short, accessible book, but it packed a lot in of both like the personal experience that I particularly identified with a lot, but then also little bits and pieces about like helpful stuff, helpful guidance. So these two very short books are the two most accessible in this category and probably in this entire video. The next three that I want to talk about in this category are all like a big step up. They're, I would argue, academic texts. I think technically two of them are, maybe the third is as well. The first one, which I do recommend but didn't hit me personally as much, is The Divergent Mind, Thriving in a World That Isn't Designed for You. I think it's just easier if I read from the back a little bit. It says, a paradigm-shifting study of neurodivergent women, drawing on historical research and modern examples of women with high sensitivity, ADHD, autism, synesthesia, and SPD, Divergent Mind explores hidden sensory worlds and gender bias, dispelling widely held misconceptions and proposing long overdue, much needed societal shifts, as well as offering answers for women who have a deep sense that they are different. I honestly feel like this is a book that I probably need to return to. I think the first time I read through it, it was just a little bit overwhelming, because I really remember enjoying like the first part of the book where it was talking about like the internal experience and reframing the concept of sensitivity, and also the history of gender bias that affects how we talk about sensitivities. The second part of the book is more specifically broken up into like different experiences or diagnoses, depending on how you want to look at them. And it breaks down how each of these different like diagnoses, so autism, synesthesia, ADHD, and sensory processing disorder, how all of those things are kind of similar, but also how they differ. So basically this book isn't just about autism. It's also about like sensory processing and like differences under that umbrella at large. So it could be a really good option if you're kind of just aware that you're like, you identify with some elements of autism, but maybe not all of them, and you're not really sure like where you fit and you think a label might be useful. This could be a really good book to dive into just to kind of have a bit of a better understanding of some of those differences. The third and final part of the book is more about like doing something differently. So it talks about like well-being and home and work and how people with different sensory experiences can support themselves and be supported. Like I said, this is definitely more on the academic end, so it was pretty dense, and depending on your own personal experience, you will find some parts of this book more useful and relevant to you than others. These next two books though were life-changing. These were my two favorite books, I think, of all the books I'm going to recommend you. Firstly, this is Autism, A Guide for Clinicians and Everyone Else. This book was definitely more on the expensive end, as academic texts tend to be, but honestly it was one of the most important and impactful books that I read personally, so I of course needed to recommend it to you. It honestly isn't quite as intimidating as it looks, because an awful lot of the pages are taken up by the references. I think what I found so special about this book is that, again, it is going through the diagnostic criteria and breaking down the diagnostic criteria in a way that is trying to essentially modernize it and make it much more relevant to all autistic people, rather than just like white male boys who are 4 years old and happen to be middle class, you know what I mean? So it's very useful in that sense. But I think the thing that made this so special and such a powerful read for me is that although the authors are clearly like entrenched in academia and healthcare, this is seeking to be like a strengths-based affirmative approach to diagnosis. And it also incorporates so many lived experience quotations and discussions. And it also takes the time to explore and discuss a whole bunch of very common autistic experiences that aren't necessarily reflected in the DSM diagnosis criteria. There's also a whole chapter on commonly like co-occurring disorders and experiences, which, as someone who was trying to figure out, like, am I bipolar and autistic, or am I just autistic and I was misdiagnosed, and where does the anxiety fit in? That was very useful for me to start to kind of try and untangle all of that for myself. At the end of the day, this book felt like a true attempt to understand the autistic experience in a very empathetic, genuine kind of way. And again, as you can see, I tabbed the living shit out of this. I underlined so much. I've gone back and reread sections. That's how much this book helped me and was relevant to me. And it really did try to focus on how the diagnostic criteria can and should be applied to people, again, who aren't white 4-year-old boys. For example, it spoke a little bit about special interests and how they believe that special interests, like that criteria, shouldn't really be assessed on how strange or unusual or niche the interest is, but rather how intense the interest is and the engagement with that interest is, which I think is something that would definitely help a lot of people. In many ways, this book feels like the big sister, the big expanded, more academic version of what this book is, and I just loved it. I can't recommend it enough. Now, the final book in this first category is my favorite book of this entire video. It is Neuroqueer Heresies, Notes on the Neurodiversity Paradigm, Autistic Empowerment, and Post-Normal Possibilities by Nick Walker. Nick Walker is queer, trans, and an educator, and in this book, it's basically like a collection of essays and different things that she has written over the span of her career as somebody who was one of the first people to kind of coin the term neuroqueer, which has come to mean a whole lot of different things to different people now. But this was incredible. It felt like a little history lesson into neuroqueer and autistic culture, which I honestly just adored. It was also inherently political, which again, I adored. This felt radical and defiant in such a loving way, and it's just something that I needed to hear and needed to read. I think especially kind of offering alternative ways of thinking about autism and autistic experience and neurodiversity more generally in ways that aren't just like medicalized or pathologized. So I don't necessarily think that this should be like the first book you read if you're like, am I autistic? What's going on? But I think that this should be something you read pretty early on in your journey because it is just so empowering and loving and celebratory, but also radical. And like I said, there's this defiance here of a defiance against external prescriptions on autistic and neurodiverse experiences. So I think that this book is honestly something everybody should read. I thought it was incredible, but I think particularly if you're kind of struggling with, I don't know, just like not feeling great about the prospect of maybe being autistic, like if that's kind of getting you down in any kind of way, I think bringing in this more radical approach could be really useful. But I think also for those of you who aren't sure whether you want to go down like the medical diagnosis route, or if you like genuinely don't think that that's right for you, this book is definitely a must read. It's not that this book is exclusively about like self-diagnosis or peer diagnosis or whatever, but it's much more rooted in affirming lived experience and also like a communal experience. And it's just wonderful. Amazing. Okay, so our next category of books are books that I would recommend for that kind of next step. Once you've already like established that you think you might be autistic or that you are autistic, I think these are the kinds of books that might be useful on the next step of your journey. The first one is actually the first book that I read when I was like, I think I'm autistic. And it is The Autists, Women on the Spectrum. In this book, the author discusses some of like the history of autism as it's been perceived by like the medical elite for the last 100 years or so, and how that framing has affected people, particularly women, today. She also takes the time to try and challenge some of the like pop culture perceptions and portrayals of autistic experience. There was definitely a whole lot in here that I didn't necessarily agree with, but that didn't mean that I didn't get like some interesting takeaways from this book. It wasn't necessarily like my favorite of the books that I read, but I still found it valuable and interesting. So I wanted to include it here. Next up is a book that probably needs no introduction. If you've been around like autistic spaces talking about books at all in the last few years, you will have heard or seen Unmasking Autism by Devon Price. Discovering the New Faces of Neurodiversity. Now, the reason I'm putting this book here is because it was actually one of the first books that I read, and I felt like I didn't get out of it what I could. Basically what I'm saying is that I need to go back and reread this book. I don't think that this is the best book to read if you're like wondering, am I autistic? Because this book is not really focused on, you know, like the different traits of autism and how to figure out if they apply to you. That's not what this book is doing. Instead, what this book is doing is looking at masking. Masking is something that a lot of us autistic people do in order to survive in society that expects us to behave in certain ways. And essentially Devon Price throughout this book is exploring the concept of masking and how and why we do it, how it's useful, but also how it is detrimental to autistic people. And ultimately how we can learn to unmask and live more authentic, whole, beautiful lives. Devon Price also talks about autism within the context of society and the ways in which they think society needs to change in order to be more accessible and welcoming and safe for autistic people, but also how a lot of those changes would actually help neurotypical people too, as is so often the case with accessibility. Throughout the book, there are literally exercises and examples given on things that you can do and steps you can take to learning to unmask, which is why I don't think that this is necessarily the perfect book for people who are just kind of like more in that questioning stage. Rather, I think that this is for the people who know that they're autistic and want some actionable steps and to learn some more about how they can live more authentically. Along those lines, this book is called Looking After Your Autistic Self, a personalized self-care approach to managing your sensory and emotional well-being. Now, this book to me didn't read as like radical as Unmasking Autism did, because Unmasking Autism I felt like did a great job of empowering the reader while also challenging society and societal biases and discrimination. This book feels a little more like self-helpy, which I think without like the context of a larger understanding can feel a little like individualistic sometimes, but equally I did find elements of this book quite helpful. It's organized and structured in a very accessible way, with different topics very clearly and like logically separated out so that it's like quite easy to go through and, you know, read through the different chunks that are relevant to you. And again, there's a bunch of like exercises and examples of like self-care for autistic people. I struggle with how to recommend this book because I do feel like I have been doing so much therapy and I've read so many self-help books over the years that although this book is like specifically about autistic experience, and I do think it frames a lot of self-help sort of ideas through an autistic lens, ultimately there wasn't a lot of new information in this book for me. But I'm aware that that might just be a me thing, given how much fucking therapy I've done. And ultimately there was something about having it all just like laid out and structured in this way that I did still find helpful. So your mileage may vary, and I think depending on, you know, your own experience, you may find this a whole lot more helpful than I did. But it's still definitely something I wanted to recommend and to let you know is out there. Now, the final book in this category is completely different. This is not like a self-help, it's not like a guidance thing, but it is one of the most wholesome, loving, empathetic books that I've ever read. And it is, of course, Love and Autism by Kerr. Kerr is an Australian autistic author. She's written a couple of like young adult books that I love. This book, though, is basically a book exploring autism and relationships in all of their many glorious varied forms. And in order to kind of explore this theme of love and relationships, Kerr essentially interviews 5 different autistic people. And these 5 people all have very, very different backgrounds and very different kinds of autistic experience. So the diversity in here is just incredible. And essentially this is not just like a portrayal of autistic love and autistic experience, but it's a celebration of it. Some of these people are married in romantic relationships, others aren't. Like, I want to make it very clear that this is not just a book about romantic love, it's about all different kinds of love. And so if you just feel like you need a big hug and a big reminder of how wonderful autistic people are and how incredible autistic love can be, and like a celebration of autistic culture, like this is absolutely a book you need to read. It was moving, it was impactful, it was sometimes sad, but it was also just like delightful. I just loved it. I cannot tell you how much I loved it. Now we're on to the memoirs. So I think the memoirs you can read at any stage, at any point, whether you're autistic or not. I mean, that's true for all of these books. Do what you want to do. But I suppose at the end of the day, these books are less about like the diagnostic criteria or like getting diagnosed or like what to do if you think you're autistic, and more just like some people talking about their own experiences. Now, all of these are AFAB people who have been diagnosed in adulthood. The first, and maybe my favorite, because like the thematic hook here is incredible, is Letters to My Weird Sister on Autism, Feminism, and Motherhood. This is by Joanne Limburg. And basically in this book, Joanne has found out in her adulthood that she's autistic. And so she decides, as a way to kind of like process this and figure this out for herself, she writes 4 different letters to 4 women from history who she identifies with in some way. She speaks about in the introduction like how all of these women, you know, may be considered autistic, like have traits that we can see as autistic, but either they didn't use that label or that label wasn't around when they were alive, and so she doesn't want to put that on anybody necessarily. She wants to find a way to like celebrate and connect with and interact with the ways in which she identifies with these people without being prescriptive of their experience. So that's why she calls them her weird sisters. The first letter is to Virginia Woolf, the second one is to Adelheid Block, the third is to Frau V, and the fourth is to Katharina Kepler. And through this book, not only is she exploring, you know, her relationship to these women and like how she can see herself reflected in their experiences, whether it is like as misunderstood women, whether it's as mothers, or whether it is as a disabled person. There's also some exploration of like history and how disabled women or weird women have been treated throughout history. This was hugely impactful, so well done, beautifully written. I learnt so much about like different experiences and disability throughout history and how that has shaped our perception of disability and autism and strangeness today. As far as like a thematic memoir, like a memoir with like a bit of conceit, I don't think I've really read many better. Highly, highly recommend. Next up, we have The Electricity of Every Living Thing, A Woman's Walk in the Wild to Find Her Way Home by Katherine May. In this memoir, we meet Katherine around her like 38th birthday when she's really struggling with motherhood, with her relationship with her husband, just really, really on the precipice, barely holding it together. And there was just something on the radio about autism, and she has this kind of like awakening of like, am I fucking autistic? At the same time, she has decided that she wants to go on this massive walk. She wants to do the 630-mile Southwest Coast Path, like along England. And so like every weekend she gets her husband to drop her off and she walks for like 4, 5, 10 hours. And so you get a bit of nature riding along with this like massive physical feat, all tied up with her figuring out that she's autistic and what this means. It's really quite impressive, like both the feat of this walk, but also just like how vulnerable she is through this book. Like she does not take pains to try and make herself look like in a more flattering light, I suppose. And it's quite hard to read in moments, but it's also really powerful. It's an incredible journey of self-discovery. And again, beautifully written. Next up, we have Late Bloomer, How Autism Diagnosis Changed My Life by Clem Bastow. And isn't this cover fun? This book is a memoir, but it feels a little bit more autobiography than those other two that feel a bit more thematic. Basically, in this book, Clem goes over her entire life from when she was young and before she was diagnosed and some of the stuff she struggled with to into her adult years and, you know, how her career's going and all of that sort of stuff until she finally finds out that she's autistic. Clem's a bit of a badass, and you can definitely tell in this book. Although this is definitely more like autobiography in terms of style and structure, she does definitely still kind of, in quite like a righteous anger kind of way that honestly felt really cathartic to me, she does challenge like the systems and society that like she's living within, which is essentially Australian society, right? That's ableist, that's racist, that's sexist. She's very straight talking, and honestly, this kind of read to me almost like your older autistic sister, like telling you how it is. She's funny, but it's also quite dark in moments. It's just really powerful, and it was just a really compelling read. Next up, we've got Strong Female Character by Fern Brady. This was on the Goodreads Choice Awards last year, I think. Now, I honestly didn't know Fern Brady, but from what I can tell, she's a bit of like a character comedian and like personality, I think, in the UK. And fittingly, this book is funny and irreverent and messed up. Of these memoirs, it probably is the darkest in terms of the content and how explicit sometimes Fern gets with her experiences and what she's been through. But equally, it is the funniest. Now, there were definitely some things in here that I didn't vibe with, but there was just so much in here that was just some of the most raw, vulnerable writing I think I've ever read. I would say it's more along the lines of Late Bloomer, where it is like memoir, but it feels structured a little bit more like autobiography, somewhere in between the two. And her essentially recontextualizing her life now with this new information that she's autistic, which I feel like is a big part of why memoirs and autobiographies are so prominent and prevalent for late diagnosed autistic people. Because I know from personal experience and from the experience of my friends that that's such a big part of the journey for us, is like restoring the narrative of our lives and making sense of the things that we've struggled with this new context. It's like heartbreaking and liberating all at once. And so I think reading about and watching other people do that too is just kind of really special. Okay, we're nearing the end. Those are the books that I wanted to talk to you about and recommend. The one book that I want to steer you away from is this one. It's one of those books that's professing to be very progressive, and I didn't finish it, to be honest with you. I DNF'd because to me it was ableist in tone. It very much felt like it was preferencing like a white upper class woman experience, and not just like in a way that it's like this is the experience we're representing, but in a way that I felt was detrimental to other experiences. It felt implicitly turfy to me, it felt implicitly classist, and it felt implicitly, sometimes explicitly ableist. Basically, it felt like the girl bossification of autistic female experience, and I just didn't like that. So I personally would steer you away from this book. But anyway, now let's talk about the other books that I do have on my shelf that I want to get to. Obviously, we'll go through these quickly. I just wanted to kind of let you know that there's some other books out there too. Firstly, and this is actually the next book on my list to read, this is We're All Neurodiverse by Sunny Jane Wise. At times challenging and radical, Sunny Jane Wise explores the intersections of neurodivergence with disability, gender, sexuality, and race. Through interviews, narratives, and the lens of their own raw experiences, they consider how current systems and structures that impact neurodivergent people are rooted in outdated capitalistic and racist frameworks, and how these need to change and adapt to be neurodiversity affirming. Next up is another short little book. We love the short little books. This one is called Taking Off the Mask, Practical Exercises to Help Understand and Minimize the Effects of Autistic Camouflaging. So this one kind of seems to me like it's going to be along the lines of Unmasking Autism, but it has a whole bunch of exercises. I think it's a lot less of the discussion and more of just getting to the work. This next one is one I picked up very recently. It's called Women and Girls on the Autism Spectrum, Understanding Life Experiences from Early Childhood to Old Age. It's an invaluable companion for professionals as well as a guiding light for autistic women to understand and interpret their own experiences. Next up we have The Autistic Experience, Silenced Voices Finally Heard. This one seems a little bit more somber. From the earliest childhood memories to the challenges facing the autistic parent and grandparent, from school days to office life, from teenagers to those in their 70s, across all genders, from people who are homeless to NASA scientists, The Autistic Experience explores the myths around autism and celebrates the right to be autistic. This one I am excited about. This one is May Tomorrow Be Awake on Poetry, Autism, and Our Neurodiverse Future. When Chris Martin, an award-winning poet and celebrated educator, starts exploring poetry with his autistic students, the results are nothing short of staggering for them all. Together they discover how poetry can reveal and amplify the dazzling, multifaceted experience of neurodivergent writers, and how their writing can help us all meet neurodivergent individuals and ourselves in gracious and liberating new ways. Then I've got Growing Into Autism by Sandra Tom Jones. Growing Into Autism is a book for all people, memorably conveying the need for a better understanding and ways of making space for a group of individuals in our society who have so much to offer. This one looks really cool. This one is the ABCs of Autism Acceptance, and it is literally broken down into like almost like this massive acrostic poem, but like an essay, if that makes sense. For example, F is for facilitated communication. This one is by like a small press, so it was a little hard to get my hands on, but I knew I needed to read it at some point. And then finally, I've got Hannah Gadsby's memoir. I have heard that this is pretty heavy in parts, but like I love Hannah Gadsby, and when I found this secondhand, you know I needed to pick it up. So those are all of the autistic books that I have to recommend to you today. And if you have any other book recommendations for me or anyone watching, please leave them in the comments below. We would love to know. A big thank you as always goes to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon, and especially big thank you to Livia, Lynette Brown, and Marie. Thank you so much for watching and for being here. I will talk to you in the next video. Until then, so much love. Bye.